So welcome back, and let's start looking at effective appraisals and giving constructive feedback. Reviewed that video then, watched that, the difficult situation that's brewing there. Problem is, he appears to have had nothing since last year. No biannual, what I mean by there is some sort of midterm or ongoing sort of supervision or review on his performance. So both him and his manager have a completely different perspective as to where they're going. Shouldn't really be any surprises, and we're going to look more about that's going to be a difficult conversation they're going to have, and we're going to look more at managing difficult conversations as a manager in the next session on communication. But an effective and appraisal system and feedback needs to have, so there's some key points to make it effective, and I just want to go through those before we go any further. To make it effective, we need to ensure that senior managers are fully committed to the process or the system. So really what I'm talking about is it's not just a process that we go through just for the sake of it or just for the workers as such. People have got to be fully committed and buy into it. And where possible, we need to get managers, employees, employee representatives, that could be unions, it could be associations, agreed on the design, especially if we're implementing a new system, for example. There should be regular monitoring of performance, not like there was in that video where it's been nothing since last year, so there's been sort of no judgment. You can't turn around to someone after 12 months and say, oh, you haven't done what I asked you to do. If you at no point have said to them, it would be unfair. If at no point you have said to them through the way, you're not meeting your targets, you're not doing what we said we were going to do, what's the problem? We need to ensure that appraisers have adequate training. They need to be confident so they can deliver fair and objective assessments. We talked about being objective, and in the unit on communication we're going to talk about managing difficult conversations, but there are skills you need to be able to deliver it. We need to make sure that people have got those skills. So have they got the active listening skills? Have they got the questioning skills to have a two-way conversation? A bit like we talked about in the coaching, so we've discussed all these skills. It's a little bit like a coaching session at times. The process needs to be simple, straightforward, and as open as possible. By that, I just mean that the people being appraised need to understand it. They need to be able to get their head around it and know what's going on if we want them to engage in the process and have a two-way process, which is what their appraisal should be. There needs to be written records of the appraisal so that people can get the feedback and we can give it, and then employees can read it afterwards. And it also allows monitoring across the process so we can look back at last year's appraisal, or people can see what people have been doing. And we also need to base it around job descriptions to help focus attention on the performance in the role and not on the person or their character. And to do that, one of the keys is, which is a big problem in a lot of organizations, is they either haven't got a job description or the job description is totally out of date and does not reflect on what the person is currently doing. And we said earlier, one of the reasons why an appraisal can be a two-way process, and for both parties, the employer and the employee, is it gives a chance to review those things. So why not build in a process of, this is where we review the job description and check that what we said you were doing and what we're judging you against, you are still doing, so it can give you that chance to do it. So quick sort of flash through of some effective points, and we're going to look at some of those as we go through the process a little bit more detail. But they are some key points that you need if it's going to be an effective process. So they are some key points to an effective system. Let's look at some approaches we can have to the actual appraisal, the actual judgment we're making on people. We're going to look at a number of systems. There's many more out there, and it could be a mix of a number of these. And after we've gone through them, we'll have a look at some of the problems with each one. And later on in an activity, you can evaluate your own appraisal system within your organisation against these. So the first one to look at is a rating system. So we're talking about a set of characteristics or whatever we agree that you're going to rate them against on a scale, and then perhaps you'll have a scale from outstanding to unacceptable and you judge each person again, or it could be 1 to 5. You're probably going to come up with some sort of total score which will be used. The second is a comparison with objectives, so a judgment against, we talked about how to set objectives, a judgment against those agreed objectives, and have those objectives been met. The next one is critical incidents. So just based on the positive and negative things that have happened during that appraisal period. A narrative report system. So just a written report describing the individual's work or performance in words over that period. Or a behaviourally rating scale approach. So each, by that, and it sounds complicated, but each role in the organisation will have a group of ratings taken from a pool of organisational behaviours, and then you'll rate it. So there'll be certain jobs that require more communication than others. There'll be certain jobs that require better written work than others, and so they'll be selected from those and put onto a scale. So each have their merits, and let's just talk about those. Briefly look at these with some positives and negatives. Rating system, very good system, set criteria, can be easy to follow, but can just become a scoring process and just all about the numbers. Comparison with objectives, great, focused on, we talked about setting objectives, can give strong focus against those objectives, but if the objectives haven't been well written in the first place and are not smart, we have a problem. Critical incidents, based on the positive and the negative, only problem is it can cause what they call a horns or a halo effect, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Narrative report, good in that it allows freedom for the appraiser to write all sorts of different areas and not be restricted, but does rely on their written skills, and I've been a victim of that in the past. And behavioural rating scale approach can be great, specific to the role, can be really useful in that, but it does rely, a bit like we talked about the job descriptions being right, it does rely on interpretation and making sure that those groupings of ratings for each role have been properly worked out. All of them good, all of them have some problems. The best normally is when they're some sort of mix, and as I said, in your activity at the end of this session, you'll be sort of evaluating your own system against those. So let's just talk about something I mentioned there, the horns and halo effect. So let's just clarify what I meant when I talked about the horns and halo effect. And it's a little bit like when we talked about unconscious bias as well. We've just got to be careful of this. I mentioned it specifically when I was talking about a critical incident sort of approach, when we're talking about positive and negative approaches, and it's how one can override the other. We might have a situation where we've got a really good employee, so we're talking about a halo, and one negative incident sort of overpowers everything else, and we start to see them as a bad person. And the other way it can affect is that we've got that person who's been a problem or has got issues, or there's something going on, and there's one little good bit just before their appraisal which makes us forget about all the negative things that have happened or all the areas that need to improve. So we just need to be careful of that as we go through the process. And all that we've talked about so far is in a a very good guide from ACAS talking about appraisals in general, which is in your resources. So we're going to move on now to start talking about the feedback we actually deliver in the appraisal, which is important, and being positive and constructive with that feedback. So we're talking about feedback now. Hopefully you recognise this, the feedback loop that we looked at in 314, 315 when we were looking at self-awareness and management of self, and we talked about feedback there a lot, and we talked about it being fair and making sure that we didn't get involved in unconscious bias, and that we referred to taking it from as many different places as possible. We talked about reviewing it against specific criteria, and we talked about the self-reflection, the self evaluation bit that the employee needs, and this works perfectly for an appraisal system. The appraisal system should involve some self-evaluation and self-awareness by the employee to bring into that formal system. So in most systems, they will know the criteria and be asked to go away and evaluate themselves on their performance against previous year's appraisal, against what's been expected of them this year, against the criteria. So it's key they know those, the criteria they've been judged against, and bring their judgment to the appraisal so that you can discuss it, go around the feedback loop, and then they can evaluate it again at the end. So still needs to be that same sort of process. Delivery of the feedback can be done in numerous ways. We'll look at a couple of recognized key ones in the next couple of slides. So as I said, let's look at a couple of methods, systems for delivering. And the first is the Corbs model. It's a set of simple but effective principles for delivering feedback. And the first of those is make sure it's a clear statement. Give the person clear and concise information about what you are giving feedback on. Don't make it muddled and unsure. The second is make sure it's owned by yourself. Make it clear that it's your view, your perception, and not the ultimate truth, because you may be looking for them to give you reasons why it isn't. So you base it on evidence, but this is how it seems to you. So own it so that they can then respond to it. It needs to be regular. It needs to be as close or imminent to the event as possible. As we said in the previous bits when we were talking about appraisals, that person in that video isn't going to get theirs for ages and ages and ages. So it needs to be regular and close or updated. It needs to be balanced. We talked about the horns and halo effect. And then it needs to be specific, based on observable behaviors, things that they can do something about. So what can we actually change? What can we do? So that goes back to the little bit like the SMART again. Is it realistic? Is it achievable? So Corbs stands for clear statement, owned, regular, balanced, and specific. And they're just some principles to follow as we deliver feedback. So Corbs that we just looked at outlines some principles. Can be quite useful to use as a checklist when you're sort of reviewing what you're going to do and how you're going to go about delivering it. But another model is SBI, that's situational behavioural impact. There's a good handout in the resources from Mind Tools, but we're going to briefly go through it. Developed by the the Centre for Creative Leadership. It outlines a process which has 3 steps. They are to identify the situation, describe the behavior, and then explain its impact. Let's break those down. So firstly, identify the situation. When you're giving feedback, you need to define when and where the situation you're referring to took place. This brings it into context and makes sure that there's no muddling and that the person has a specific setting or a reference to go to. So for example, informal feedback that you might have delivered about something that just happened, you might be saying during yesterday's meeting you gave that presentation, or at that client meeting this afternoon, I think. So you're giving them something specific. If it was an annual appraisal, you might be talking about during the 3rd quarter this happened, or when you had that situation. So you need to make sure it's specific so they understand it. Next, stage 2 is to describe the behavior. So what is the specific behaviors or actions that you want to address? What are you talking about? This can be the most challenging part of the process. We have to focus on what we've directly observed and not be making assumptions or be subjective about their behaviors, because that could undermine the whole process. At this point, we're not making assumptions or relying on others' comments, subjective judgments. We're trying to focus on what happened. If you've seen someone make a mistake, for example, and you think it's because they haven't prepared properly, you don't say that. You should be letting them, because you don't know what's gone on. So it's not about your subjective opinion. It's not about hearsay, what someone's told you, because that might jeopardize the whole feedback in your relationship. So, for example, if something had happened during yesterday morning's team meeting when you gave your presentation, you seemed uncertain about 2 of the slides and your sales calculations appeared incorrect. Or if something's gone well, you could say at that client meeting this morning or this afternoon, you ensured the meeting started on time, everyone had handouts in advance, and all the research was correct and everybody's questions were answered. So you're being specific about what it is, good or bad, about the behaviors that you want to focus on. And the final stage, step 3 in the SBI model, is about explaining the impact. So in this, you're using I statements and you're trying to tell them, describe what impact it has had on yourself or others, and then what we can do with it going forward. So for example, in the 2 situations we've talked at, During yesterday's team meeting, when you gave your presentation, you seemed uncertain about 2 slides and your sales calculations were incorrect. You explained then that that felt embarrassing because everybody was there and it was an embarrassing situation, and you're also worried about the effect it's going to have on the reputation going forward of your team. For the client meeting, when we had positive, we could be saying you ensured that it started in time, that everyone had their handouts, your research was correct, and all the client's questions were answered. You can say that you were really proud, it was an excellent job, and it put the organisation in a good light. You feel confident that it'll mean that we keep that account, and you thank them for all their hard work. So again, impact on the team and on the business and the organisation. So SBI is more of a process than the one which is more of some principles, and you can follow this as you go through the situation to make sure that your feedback is effective. So all this is great, having a good appraisal system, but we need to ensure that we're fair and objective when we're doing it. We've talked about this a couple of times. So how do we ensure that the process and our feedback is fair and objective? Well, there's 4 keys really. The first is to make sure that we have clear policies and processes and that everyone can access them. The second is make sure we've got specified criteria, and we've talked about that and mentioned that before, so that everyone knows and it's understood. The third is we make sure that it stays private and confidential. And then 4th, we make sure that our data or information is taken from a variety of sources, as we talked about, that stops unconscious bias, etc. So let's break those down and have a look at those individually. So first, process and policy. As we've already stated a number of times, we need to ensure that policy and process is there for performance management. That'll include things such as supervisions, appraisals, any observations of people's performance and monitoring, and that it's clear and understood. It clearly outlines the responsibilities, timescales, where things are going to be done, and it shows a process for monitoring it. The next is specific criteria, defined in the process and policies with guidance given, telling people what it covers, and usually around competencies, behaviours or job specs, and we said how important it is that they're up to date. It needs to remain private and confidential, so it needs to ensure there's a clear process around roles and responsibilities, so that we know who we can trust and which information will be given and passed to and who it will be passed to. We need to build relationships. There needs to be trust there, which allows that engagement in the process, and it needs to allow openness and honesty, which the other 2 above will lead to, and that means that people will engage and take an honest part in it. They'll believe it's about their development and their improvement. And then the final stage, which has already come up, we're talking about using information from a variety of resources, feedback, stats, metrics. So it's based on facts, it's objective. We've mentioned objectivity before, but we need to ensure that we're sticking to the facts and not voicing our opinions unless we're qualified or in a position to do so, and sticking to the actual performance and not the characteristics of the person. We need to have a variety of evidence. As we've talked about, it could be observed from performance, it could be statistics, but they don't tell the true picture around attitude and behaviours, and it could be feedback from others, so that we're getting a 360 all-round sort of approach. And that gives us those different perspectives and protects us against our unconscious bias or any accusations that we're being biased. So feedback needs to be positive, it needs to be clear, it needs to have a constructive element, and to do that we need to make sure that it's fair and it's objective. So let's have a look at the activity we want to do around feedback. So hopefully we've established that employees' appraisals are a 2-way process in which they are engaged, not something that is done to them, because it can have a massive impact on the team dynamics and on the individual if they are not clear how they're being judged, so what the criteria is, if they don't think things are being kept confidential or that other people are being treated differently or they might find out about those, they're not going to engage with it and they're not going to be open. If everyone knows their role, their place, their part in the team, and they feel they're being fairly judged against a set of criteria by an objective process of balanced information, not just stats, for example, or not just what they've done for the boss, then it's going to be objective and they'll engage and respond better. And this will boost individual motivation and boost the team's togetherness. So In this activity, we're going to watch a video clip about how to not be engaged in the two-way process. And after that, I want you to look at your organization's policies and procedures regarding performance and complete the activity sheet, which will involve you sort of looking at where and what's done within yours and what's used and how your policies and procedures meet some of the things we've talked about. This should give you some good research for Unit 305, which is a skills unit on managing people, where you're going to have to show that you've been involved in this sort of process. So complete that, and then we'll move on to the next session.